We're here with Jim and Troy. Welcome, guys.
Thanks, Brett.
All right, so we're going to discuss the session today. And when you look at what happened this year, I think we've got to go back to the beginning for a little context. So going into session, I mean, it really had its own personality. And, you know, the typical triangle, the political triangle, if you will, between the governor and the president and the speaker, in past years, it's different every year. How would you guys characterize the relationships and the dynamics between those three? Jim, why don't we start with you?
Well, it was pretty contentious at times. I mean, the Republicans control everything, but the speaker and the Speaker Corcoran, Richard Corcoran, and the governor were at odds throughout the session about the governor's priorities. And, you know, the Senate kind of laid back in the weeds there for quite a bit of the session. But then towards the end, the Senate and the House couldn't reach agreement on a budget. So it was pretty contentious, and they had to go into overtime to deal with the budget. And, you know, I think it was one of those sessions that, you know, they had money coming in. They wound up having enough money. But there were just a lot of personalities and a lot of issues that really clashed throughout the session.
Yeah, and then you had the governor who decided to take his tour around the state and go into candidates or representatives' districts. Troy, what did you see from that perspective?
I saw what I've seen for the past 7.5 years, which is Governor Scott with one more big L on his forehead after a combustible session. You know, he came in expecting a lot, as he has every single session, and getting an iota of what he asked for from the legislature. I think to a large extent he had a pretty good first term. The second term has not been good at all. He has been a de facto lame duck, and I think this solidifies his lame duck status heading into 2018. He didn't get what he wanted in terms of tax cuts. He didn't get Enterprise Florida, didn't get Visit Florida. And lawmakers, frankly, don't need him at this point. You know, he's going to be off into the nether region in 2019, be it Washington or maybe going home to Naples. We'll have to see what happens there. But I think in terms of his political capital, his remaining capital, it's going to be a tough 2018 session based upon what we saw here in 2017.
So uphill climb for a future legislative agenda for the governor. All right, so let's look at that, right? So the governor's out, you know, doing his own brand of politics. Meanwhile, you've got the silent Senate or the quiet Senate, and then you've got Speaker Corcoran, who by all intents and purposes was the star of the session and really kind of, you know, set the agenda. There were days he had good days, days he had bad days, but ultimately, I mean, it was his theme or his narrative.
Well, I think he was definitely the dominant figure of the session. I think some people might quibble with the star description, because he scared a lot of people,
right,
and he angered a lot of people, and he also kept his troops in line. But and he got generally what he wanted. But you know, he also left a lot of turmoil in his wake throughout the session. But he was the dominant figure of the session, I think. I'm not sure anybody would quibble with that. And he got his priorities, which included, you know, a major education package, and also, you know, he came in. It wasn't a big issue early in the session, but it became a bigger issue through the session. Was to get a homestead exemption expansion on the 2018 ballot, and he went to the mat for that, and he got it. You know, and I think there were a lot of senators, particularly, who weren't really crazy about the idea. But Corcoran pushed the right buttons to get what he wanted through the session.
And critically, a lot of people back home now know who Richard Corcoran is. I can't recall a session, even going back to Marco Rubio, where rank and file voters knew who the Speaker of the House is. A lot of people don't even know we have a Florida House. You know, they don't pay attention to the process up here. I put Richard Corcoran on TV 3 days out of 5 every week going into the session and all through the session, because he was speaking to issues that resonate with voters back home. So people know who he is, and I think that bodes well for him, by the way, in terms of 2018 politics.
Right. So let's take a look at that. So you had Speaker Corcoran as the dominant figure on the House side, but you had multiple figures rising up in the Senate. You had President Negron, and then you had Senator Latvala in that mix, plus a few others. So Troy, why don't you if you can, dive a little deeper into the Senate. What did you see happening over there?
You know, I saw what I think, and Jim might agree with me on this, what I saw back in 2011 when Mike Herodopoulos was president of the Senate, and we had that session meltdown at 3 o'clock in the morning. Herodopoulos took the rostrum, shed a tear, because he didn't get what he wanted in those final hours. And I think once again, the House has bested the Florida Senate. Now we'll have to see how this dynamic works in 2018, because to your point, Brad, one of the big bears of the Senate is Jack Latvala, and he's not going to take what happened, I think, lying down. And so while they were able to come to an agreement on the budget, on a number of other issues, I think there were a lot of issues outstanding that were priorities for the Senate that ultimately didn't happen. And that could make for a difficult atmosphere, I think, next year.
I agree to a certain extent, but I also think if you step back and look at it, Senate President Joe Negron came into this session with two priorities. And really, those were his priorities. One was to bolster support for the state university system. He wanted to increase scholarship money and change a lot of structural things, block tuition, which was an issue for him. And he got all that in the end. In the horse trading with Corcoran, he got that. The other thing that was the most important, probably even more than the universities to Negron, was being able to build a reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee to help his district, which is near there. And he got that too in the end. Again, it took some horse trading, took a little compromise, but he got it. He was able to go home with that. So to a certain extent, I agree with Troy, but I also think you have to step back and look at what his priorities were personally.
Right.
And I think he got those two big priorities done. And I think Corcoran, too, was smart enough to know that if he got his and Negron got his, then everything else would sort of move forward.
Right. Well, let's move into the issues, because ultimately everybody that's involved in this process is trying to walk away with something. So let's look at the big ones, right? So you've got the budget, you were just going there, but let's look at like workers' comp. That's an issue that should steal all the oxygen and go, but you had other issues like gambling and marijuana implementation. So dealer's choice. Why don't we start running through the issues of what passed and what didn't? Troy?
Well, how about medical marijuana?
Okay.
And going back to the conversation a couple of minutes ago, I think had medical marijuana passed, that would have been a horrible thing for the Senate, because they totally caved to the House's position on this bill. The question now, though, is what happens with regard to implementation? It goes back to DOH. I spoke with Carlos Guillermo-Smith, a Democrat in the House from Orlando. He said this is disastrous because Rick Scott appointees will now be in charge of implementing Amendment 2.
Well, the other thing is the Department of Health has had a ton of problems implementing a much more limited form of medical marijuana over the last 2 years. There's been lots of legal challenges. Really, it's been a messy process. Now they have a humongous medical marijuana initiative to try to do by themselves without legislative guidance, and that could be a problem.
Well, it does help they have a compassionate use office. They've had a year to rev up here, but to Jim's point, they have been very slow going in implementing these regulations with regard to Charlottesville.
So do you think they just take the language of the Senate and the House and they try and just cobble that together and take the most middle road and wait for next year?
I think they're going to do whatever the executive office of the governor wants.
Okay.
It really does come down to the plaza level on this one until next session at least.
Well, the problem with that, though, is that it isn't as simple as just cobbling together a little bit of language, because they're going to get challenged in court and probably administratively if they're not very careful on this. They'll probably get challenged anyway. But the history of this issue over the past 2 years is lots of legal challenges, because there's potentially so much money out there for the vendors and the companies that would actually be able to grow and sell this stuff.
Which is job security for us. Right. It's going to be a fun summer.
Well, it was a session of disruption. I mean, it seemed like you had a lot of technologies being discussed and bills wrapped around things like Uber and vacation rentals. Uber passed. You had disruption of a Prohibition-era liquor law on the door in the store, or whiskey and Wheaties. Let's talk about a couple of those that did make it across the finish line, Uber and whiskey and Wheaties.
On whiskey and Wheaties, I'm anxious to see...
And for our viewers, whiskey and Wheaties is the ability to sell alcohol in a grocery store.
Like they do in a lot of states.
Sure.
I believe over 30 at this point. The big question for me is how will the governor treat this bill? Because it passed by a single vote in the Florida House, and you had, I believe, 5 members who, if they were on the floor, and this is a separate issue, why weren't they on the floor to vote on this important bill, said they would have voted no.
Well, the other thing is that Corcoran was down on the floor pushing buttons to get those enough votes, and if the governor wants to get a bit of revenge, this might be one he could use, but to your point.
Right. So gambling. So let's go to gambling. That's one that every year we go in, and every year you have stalemate, it seems like. But let's get into the weeds on that. What happened with gambling, and why are we sitting in the same spot now as we are when we walked into session?
Gambling is always a difficult issue to deal with for the legislature. You have so many different agendas, both from the parts of the gambling industry. You also have the anti-gambling folks. It's always difficult to cobble together a deal on gambling. Seminole Tribe was a big player in this year's negotiations. In the end, I just think they had a hard time being able to fit together all those different industries to get something out that would be acceptable. You know, the stated reason that it fell apart was that the Senate insisted on allowing slot machines in 8 counties where there's been referendums to approve slot machines. And the stated reason was the Senate wanted those 8 slots in those 8 counties, the House didn't. But I tend to think it's more complicated than that. I mean, there are so many moving parts in a gambling bill, so many industries and lobbyists at play that, it seems like every time one of these comes up, it just collapses under its own weight.
And philosophically, you just have a more conservative Florida House with regard to this issue than the Senate. It's always been that way,
right,
with regard to gambling.
All right. So I was so eager to get to gambling, I skipped over Uber. Let's jump in.
Double down on that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We'll double down. So let's talk about Uber. I mean, you had the collapse of the Hillsborough taxi cab agency as a result of this. You had Uber, passing its new technology and that taxi cab versus the ride-sharing technology. I mean, this was the battle royale, if you will.
And it's become just a popular way of getting around, much more so than even this time last year. It's a big win, by the way, for our friend Stephanie Smith. Because she has been lobbying this one now for a number of years, and I mean this was the big enchilada for Uber. I don't know what they're going to have to lobby on going forward because they got everything they wanted. It's not good for the taxi cab industry, obviously, and a big reason it passed was because Andy Gardner was not here.
I was just about ready to say that. Former Senate President Andy Gardner, I think, pretty much single-handedly blocked this issue over the past couple of years. He's out of the picture, and it went through very smoothly in the Senate. I mean, there was very few votes against it in the Senate, in committees or on the floor. And once he was out of the way, I think it pretty much has sailed right through.
Yeah, I think other than the taxi cabs, the people that are most sad about this going through is everybody that Uber was paying to get their issue across the bench.
Well, local governments were unhappy about this bill because it does take away authority from local governments to regulate.
Right.
So, I mean, there is another side to that issue, but it was clear sailing this year.